One of the defining pillars of the Cold War was nuclear weapons. By the time of the hydrogen bomb, the weapon itself was so destructive that if a general war ever broke out, the few surviving winners of a war would likely have little victory to celebrate. And yet, this hasn't stopped nations from pursuing the technology. The official nuclear states of the Cold War, the United States, the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, China, and eventually India, each declared their membership in the nuclear club. But other nations knocked on the door also. In a recent episode, we discussed 3 states who pursued membership but subsequently halted their programs: Sweden, Brazil, and Argentina. But there were multiple other nations who also looked to gain membership, 2 of which we promised to discuss. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at the Cold War nuclear programs of South Africa and Israel. This is the Cold War. Unofficially, Israel was the 6th country to obtain nuclear weapons at some point during the 1960s, though the exact time remains unclear. The desire to have such weapons is almost as old as the country itself. For Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, Israel would only be able to achieve any sort of parity with its Arab neighbors by turning to science, believing that quality in technology could compensate for Israel's demographic, geographic, and resource disadvantage. As his aide at the time, future Prime Minister Shimon Peres put it, quote, "Ben-Gurion believed that science could compensate us for what nature had denied us." The nascent state initially turned to the United States for nuclear assistance under the Atoms for Peace initiative, with a 1955 agreement resulting in the US giving Israel a small research reactor which included safeguards so that it would only be used for peaceful purposes. Realizing that the United States would not be willing to provide the help they needed to build the bomb, the Israelis instead turned to France. Relations between Israel and France, though only a few years old, quickly intensified, especially in the security domain. The two shared intelligence and engaged in conventional arms purchases, but also collaborated on nuclear research. They had begun working together in 1953 and steadily grew closer, with Israeli scientists being invited to study and work at France's first nuclear reactor, the Châtillon nuclear establishment. During the talks and preparations for the military operation that would culminate in the Suez Crisis, the two countries agreed in principle that France would sell an EL-3 type research reactor to Israel. According to Israeli-American historian Avner Cohen, the French did not explicitly demand that Israel participate in the Suez mission, but that it served as a, quote, implicit incentive for both nations. The effort to take the Suez Canal, initiated by an Israeli invasion, followed by a coordinated Anglo-French peacekeeping effort, followed Egypt's nationalization of the canal, proved to be an unmitigated disaster. But the risk of Soviet intervention and the American rebuke of its allies for their actions led both France and Israel to double down on their efforts to obtain nuclear weapons. In 1958, Israel began building the Dimona Nuclear Research Center, located in Israel's Negev desert. France's Charles de Gaulle, upon briefly becoming prime minister, chose to formally end his country's involvement in the Israeli program, but allowed French firms to fulfill their contractual obligations. The Israelis turned to Norway for heavy water, which was initially sold to the UK before being repurchased by the Norwegians for export to the Middle East. Despite pledging to both London and Oslo that their intentions were purely peaceful, the Israelis used the heavy water for producing plutonium. Plutonium, a man-made element, began being produced in 1965, producing enough of the radioactive material to allow an estimated 2 to 3 bombs to be built by the time the Six-Day War began in June 1967. Now, the Eisenhower administration did not take a firm position on the Israeli effort. Upon getting intelligence on Dimona in 1958, the administration did not act on the information, but later asked for an explanation in 1960. The Kennedy administration, however, took a more strident position on the issue of non-proliferation, pressuring the Israelis into accepting inspections. Despite saying yes, the Israelis went to considerable lengths to conceal their true intentions. American inspectors were not allowed to bring their own equipment, nor permitted to see the control room, among numerous other restrictions. By 1969, when the inspections ended, the American inspectors lacked any concrete evidence of weapons due to the successful concealment efforts, but suspicions remained. The Johnson administration tried to pressure Israel into signing the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, by linking it to the sale of Phantom aircraft. The Israeli counterproposal was an offer to sign the NPT if the US offered other concessions, including security guarantees. The Israelis knew the Americans were unlikely to agree to the counterproposal, and besides, the US proceeded to sell the planes without Israeli ratification of the NPT anyway. In 1969, President Richard Nixon and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir reached an understanding whereby the US would end its inspections and stop putting pressure on the Israeli nuclear weapons program in exchange for Israel neither declaring nor testing its nuclear capability. Israel's possession of a nuclear arsenal is widely acknowledged, with one notable exception: Israel itself. Unlike other nuclear weapons states, Israel does not formally acknowledge their nuclear status, but nor does it deny it either. Instead, they opt for a policy of nuclear ambiguity, referred to in Hebrew as amemut. As a result, it has refused to sign or ratify the NPT. This legal fiction, though known by US intelligence to be false, has enabled Israel to avoid running into roadblocks in its relationship to Washington. It's against US law, for example, to provide aid to a proliferating state. In 1965, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol promised that, quote, Israel will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Arab-Israeli area. But what does this mean? This was intentionally left vague. Did it mean the first to introduce a bomb into a war? And what was their definition of nuclear weapons? Did it mean it was not a bomb until the last screw was fastened, and that before that it was not a nuclear weapon? Ambiguity remains. Despite the fact that the whole world is aware of Israel's possession of nuclear weapons, the Israeli government has nonetheless sought to maintain amemut. However, this was compromised in 1986. Born in Morocco in 1954 and subsequently immigrating to Israel in 1963, Mordechai Vanunu was a technician in the Dimona Nuclear Research Center. Having worked at the facility since 1977, Vanunu left his job in 1985, having grown increasingly disillusioned, and then being notified that he was going to be made redundant. Before leaving his job for a planned backpacking trip in East Asia, Vanunu decided to photograph equipment which included, among other things, laboratory models for a full-scale model of a thermonuclear bomb. The following year, Vanunu was in Australia and participated in a demonstration with a group of anti-nuclear Christians, where he met a journalist named Oscar Guerrero, who convinced Vanunu to make the material public. On the 5th of October 1986, the London-based Sunday Times published an article using Vanunu's revelations. The article revealed the fact that Israel's nuclear weapons program was far more extensive than previously thought, including that the Middle Eastern state was capable of producing a radiation-maximizing neutron bomb, as well as having a significantly greater quantity of plutonium than otherwise believed. The article also explained how Israel had previously fooled American experts that had visited Dimona. Deception included false walls as well as hidden elevators, which meant that the American visitors were unaware of the 6 concealed underground floors at the facility. Unsurprisingly, his intentions to divulge the information, and likely not helped much by his conversion to Christianity, earned him few friends in Israel, as many worried that it would jeopardize Israel's relationship with Washington. Shimon Peres, by then Israel's prime minister, called Vanunu a traitor to this country. 5 days before the Sunday Times ran the story, Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, successfully lured Vanunu away from London to Rome, potentially in a bid to prevent causing any embarrassment for British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. This was done by means of a classic intelligence operation conducted by a Mossad honey trap named for the mission Cindy. Once in Italy, Vanunu was drugged, gagged, and then secretly smuggled back to Israel. He was subsequently convicted for espionage and treason in a closed trial and served 18 years in a prison, including more than 11 years in solitary confinement. Separate from all this, but still related, in 1980, in a bid to maintain its nuclear monopoly in the Middle East, Israel carried out a strike on the Osirak reactor in Iraq. The Israelis, who argued that the reactor was intended for an eventual weapons program, viewed the attack as, quote, a precedent for every future government in Israel. in the words of then Prime Minister Menachem Begin. The move, though a tactical success, was arguably a failure in the long run. The strike convinced the Iraqis that the Israelis were a threat, resulting in Baghdad doubling down and intensifying their weapons program. Leave us a comment if you'd like us to take a more in-depth look at the Iraq strike and the Iraqi nuclear program in general. So that's a look at the Israeli program. Now what about our second country today? Aptly named, at the tip of the continent, South Africa, emerged as the only successful African nuclear-armed state. Others like Egypt or Libya had programs, but were never completed, while Algeria had only the dubious honor of being the original French testing site. South Africa's foray into all things nuclear began, like much of its economy, in mining. The country possesses rich uranium deposits. As part of the Atoms for Peace initiative, South Africa and the United States signed a 50-year cooperation agreement in 1957, which in 1961 led to an American company providing South Africa with the nuclear reactor Safari 1, commissioned in 1965. Creatively, Safari stood for the South African Fundamental Atomic Research Installation. 2 years later, the country built its own reactor, Safari 2, for the production of plutonium, though this was abandoned in 1969 over concerns of the large amounts of national resources that it was draining from the rest of the country. Then, in 1971, arguing that it would be beneficial for the mining industry, South Africa began a research program on PNEs, peaceful nuclear explosions. It was this program which eventually morphed into a nuclear weapons program. At some point between 1973 and 1978, the South African government made the shift, though the exact period remains unclear. South Africa's advancement worried the Soviets, who hoped that they could cooperate with the United States to prevent it from going any further, but to little avail. However, the Soviets, through the use of satellite surveillance technology, discovered the South African test site, and informing the United States, they then brought pressure against the South Africans, who relented and abandoned the test site. The South African program stands out in that it developed in a region without any potential nuclear competitors. This is in comparison to nations in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, or even Latin America. According to an October 1977 US Special National Intelligence estimate, South Africa was motivated by a, quote, growing feeling of isolation and helplessness, perceptions of a major military threat, and desire for regional prestige. Growing international opposition to apartheid, the Portuguese withdrawal from Angola and Mozambique, the demise of white minority rule in Rhodesia, and the growth of left-wing guerrilla movements across the region left the South African authorities feeling increasingly worried. That sense of insecurity continued to increase through the 1970s, partially as a result of the Cuban intervention in Angola, a UN arms embargo, as well as waning support from European states, coupled with a worry that South African-controlled Namibia, which neighbors Angola, might be invaded with Soviet backing. Now, at the same time this was happening, South Africa began to collaborate with Israel on its nuclear weapons program. This initially began in the 1960s, with the former exporting yellow cake uranium to the latter. By the 1970s, the two countries had mutually agreed to remove bilateral safeguards, which freed up to 500 tons of uranium to be used by Israel at Dimona. In September 1979, a US surveillance satellite detected a double flash, something usually associated with nuclear weapons tests, off the coast of South Africa. Though never fully confirmed, it was widely believed in US intelligence circles to have been a nuclear test, though whether this was a South African, Israeli, or joint test remains unclear. This has become known as the Vela incident, and while we were going to give a rundown of the test here, we've decided to do a breakaway episode focused just on the subject, so make sure you stay tuned for that coming soon. Okay, so South Africa has the unique distinction among nuclear weapon states, even the unofficial ones, in that it is the only one that has dismantled its bomb. This stands in contrast to countries like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus, which had nuclear weapons, but not a program, this being the result of inheriting the weapons on their territory at the time of the Soviet Union's dissolution. It also stands in contrast to countries like Iraq and Libya, which dismantled their weapons of mass destruction programs, but had never successfully built a bomb. In 1988, a tripartite agreement was signed between South Africa, Angola, and Cuba, which led to the withdrawal of approximately 50,000 Cuban soldiers and Namibian independence from South Africa. This resulted in an improved security situation for South Africa, thereby reducing the perceived threat that initiated the desire for the bomb in the first place. By the time it had dismantled its program and arsenal in 1990, the country had built 6 nuclear weapons, having planned for the construction of a 7th. In 1993, the legislature passed the Non-Proliferation of Weapons and Mass Destruction Act, and in 1995, South Africa, along with 42 other states on the continent, signed the African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty in 1996. In doing so, the country became the only known nation to have possessed nuclear weapons and then dismantled them. It's important to note here that neither South Africa or Israel has ever been officially part of the nuclear club. It's widely recognized that South Africa had the bomb, that Israel has the bomb, but because neither nation had or has ever officially conducted a test of their weapons program, they are not technically members of the club. This limbo state allows for the pretense that the nuclear club is both limited and exclusive, and that such efforts as the NPT are more successful than they are. The truth is that nuclear weapons technology is a matter of dedicating time and resources. Any nation with sufficient amounts of these and the will to do so can become a nuclear state, officially or not. I'm hearing news as this is being written that the United States has produced its first nuclear weapons pit in 35 years, the first since the end of the Cold War. We are possibly entering a new period of global security destabilization, and with that, it is increasingly likely that more nations will consider obtaining nuclear weapons. As this happens, the danger that a nuclear exchange could take place does nothing but increase. Food for thought as we bring this episode to a close. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is conveniently located right next to the nuclear launch button. I wonder if YouTube would consider changing from a bell button to a dual key system. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.